Before we get started, I would like to introduce myself. I am Fredrick Addai, a postgraduate associate at the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, or ELTI. And today I'm joined by my colleagues, Gillian Bloomfield, ELTI's Associate Director of Online Programs, and Abiyok, ELTI's Program Administrator. We are pleased to welcome you to the last session of our four-part webinar series titled Agroforestry and Carbon, Addressing Climate Change Through Tree-Based Agriculture in Tropical Regions. On April 4th, we discussed agroforestry as a climate solution. And on April 11th, we discussed designing agroforestry for carbon sequestration. Last week, that was April 18th, we had an exciting discussion on connecting agroforestry projects to the carbon market. And today we are going to have a Q&A session with all our panelists from all the 3 weeks. So today we have with us Dr. Florencia Montagnini, Sarika, Dr. Robert Zuma, Azaria Kalimba, who will be joining us shortly. Daniel Piero will also be joining us shortly. Siko will also be joining us, and Emma van der Ven. Dr. Peter Umune would unfortunately not be joining us today because he is out for a job duty. Moving to the agenda for today, the Q&A is divided into two parts. We'll first have the first part, which will consider questions we compiled from the previous sessions. The second part of the Q&A is going to be 30 minutes, which will be a live interactions with our audiences. During this session, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom so that Abby can unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question live. We will have a 10 minutes closing remarks from Dr. Florencia Montagnini, and we'll follow it by about 5 minutes of announcements, and that should bring us to about an hour and 15 minutes. So starting with our first question, and this question is directed towards Sarika and Robert, but if any other speaker feels they have insights to share, please feel free to do so. So I read the first question, and between questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have a very good look at our speakers. Question 1. There's much potential for agroforestry to be climate solution, but are farmers willing to plant trees? What incentives will motivate farmers to plant or keep trees on their farms? Over to you, Sarika or Robert.
And both of you, Sarika and Robert, you're welcome to both activate your microphones, and that could be for the speakers. You can, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll let Sarika go first unless she wants me to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, sir. So for agroforestry holds significant potential as a climate solution. In integrating tree plantation into the agriculture practices, enhancing the biodiversity, sequestration potential, and improving the soil health. However, if we come to the willingness part of the farmers, particularly I am observing the Indian scenario, to opt these practices can be influenced by various challenges and incentives. For if we motivate the farmers, we have to come up with some incentives. For example, financial incentives we can give, subsidies to the tree plantation, tax benefit we can give, or direct payment for the ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration can make the agroforestry more appealing. Coming to the microfinancing options and insurance scheme against the crop failure due to unforeseen environmental factor can also encourage the participation. If we come to the technical and educational support, training program that can educate farmer about the benefit of the agroforestry, how effectively implementing it, and can address the knowledge gap. Extension services that provide ongoing support and advice are crucial for motivating these farmers for the planting the tree. Another thing which is research and development, investing in the research developing superior plant material, and that is that they can adopt according to climate change, local condition that can help adopting to the climate change. And this would also help including the developing crop variety that are resilient to the changing climate. That another thing is youth engagement program, like that program that make agriculture and agroforestry appealing to the youth through technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship programs can regenerate the interest of the youth in the farming. So from my side, this is the answer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarika, and thank everybody for opportunity to participate here. But thank you, Sarika, for a very comprehensive overview. What I would add, and I agree with all of that, that's a very detailed and well-articulated kind of overview. What I might add is really that this set of incentives is really very, very site-specific or region-specific, country-specific, and even more subnational specific. These sets of incentives that may or may not work for particular agroforestry systems. One of the first things, of course, really is identifying appropriate systems that work for farmers, really. And they need, so these incentives, you can give all the incentives you want if the species aren't adapted to the climate, or they're not adapted to the production system that the farmer can deal with. And basically then the farmer needs to find some sort of actual incentive on his own. I mean, a value to having these trees in his field. And so the availability of either marketing or the usefulness of these trees to farmers. So, you know, on the one hand, the agroforestry system may provide various roles within the farming system. For example, it might be limited in some cases to maintaining fertility, and that's the major issue. In other places, it's really about cash. Is there a market for these? Or there might be subsistence issues. For example, the availability of firewood or compost or animal feed. So the kind of incentives really have to be tailored to the nature of the production system, the type of farmer. So now when we talk about more developed countries, if we look for incentives in places where the dominant agricultural form is large farms and agro-industrial type production, here we might look at a set of incentives that include things, the financial incentives, tax incentives, but also some regulatory incentives. And for example, in the United States, the combination of regulatory and financial incentives have pretty good success with things like conservation easements, riparian buffer zones, these kind of incentives. When it comes to developing countries, microfinance, training, extension, all of these become vitally important if we look, and the value chain, establishing value chains for commodity products that could come out of the good example from India is the poplar production north of in Uttar Pradesh, where the incentive was a match factory that provided training, extension, and financial incentives and created quite a large agroforestry system up there. So that's what I have to add there. I'll let the next speaker take up from there. Thank you.
I would like to just add to what you both said, that totally I agree, to just stress the importance of technical assistance, because it's key, it's absolutely key. I think sometimes we are a little bit, we in the academic community, a little bit top down in this. We say to the farmer, oh, we need to plant all these trees because we need to get the carbon dioxide levels to go down by so many petagrams by 2030, and by 2050 want to be totally carbon neutral and all that. But we, and how about them? And in many experiences in Colombia, for example, that we have witnesses. In Costa Rica, Nicaragua, a program was designed with a combination of technical assistance and payment for environmental services to promote intensive silvopastoral systems, a very sustainable way of growing cattle and raising cattle. And it was analyzed with real nice variables and all that. The combination of technical assistance and the payments was very, very important. So especially when you're talking about developing countries, and sometimes the technical assistance is not there, it doesn't reach the farmers. That's all I wanted to say. Maybe Daniel or somebody else will want to say something else.
Yeah, maybe I can add all very good comments. I must say, I totally agree with your observations. I think in a way, of course, incentives always help, and not logically, payments for environmental services for CAMBOs will surely be helping there as well. It also, I think, comes to like showing the tangible benefits of doing agroforestry for, of course, the farming system, for improving yields, for improving soils, for even health goals, for example. And I think one of the nice things you can do there is having front leaders, pioneers, farmers that really already do an agroforestry system, have a demo farm in a project, bring the farmers over there and let them see and talk with another colleague farmer, so to say, so that they can really interact on a farmer by farmer level. And it doesn't come from a person like me going there and telling them all kind of maybe high-level academic stories and maybe not even connecting on the same language level, so to say. But yeah, it's much more, a farmer can be much more easily convinced and getting into discussion with another farmer from the same country, same maybe cultural background, showing, look, guys, what I did is I used these species for my cattle feeding, for example, or I use these species. Look, you need to prune them and manage them like this. Then they produce double the yields. Look, I planted trees and now my cows are more healthy because they can enjoy the shade. Such examples, I think it's much more easy for farmers to learn from a co-farmer than maybe from the other extensionist. And that's also one of the reasons why within Acorn we use a lot of the lead farmers. We have a kind of system where we have lead farmers to promote and other farmers to join the program, so to say.
I would like to close with, in the context of this webinar, we would hope that we can figure out the ways to get carbon credits to be a good incentive. And at our school, we have a project where we want to add to the biodiversity credits as another incentive. So the combination of both, hopefully, that's why we're here in this webinar today, especially when we were figuring in the second webinar, we were talking about marketing carbon. So hopefully that will become a little bit more relevant as incentives in the near future or today.
Yeah, thank you for your insights about the question. And personally, I feel that in some systems such as the Tonja system, land rights security is very important, because there was a case in Ghana that farmers were intentionally killing trees in a Tonja agroforestry system because they felt they didn't have security in the future. So that is another point that we should consider when we are thinking about agroforestry and planting trees and carbon. Yeah, so we move on to our second question. I'll share my screen real quick. So our second question is directed towards Siko and Robert and Daniel, but everyone else can also share their ideas about the question. And it reads, can you discuss carbon measurements and how it relates to the ability to connect an agroforestry system to the carbon market? How does measuring carbon sequestration differ for agroforestry in comparison with forest? And which type of measurements are needed? So Daniel, Siko, and Robert, would you like to answer?
Well, I can start with this one. The second question, I think, is the very important. And one thing that we really need to take care when like calculating carbon from agroforestry systems, that you know, the allometric models that we've been using. So I don't know if everybody is familiar with like an allometric model. Basically, we build a model where we can, you know, use like measurements of GBH and height and wood density, and then estimate the value of the biomass of a single tree. And the allometry is related to the tree form. And then most of our allometric models that we've been using were made using trees from natural forests or like plantations, where you get, you know, like tight spacing. So the form of the trees will be different compared to agroforestry systems. So I feel that there is a lack of allometric models they're like made for agroforestry systems. So and my belief is that, you know, we're like underestimating when we use a model that was built for like a natural forest or for a plantation, we end up like underestimating the carbon of a tree in an agroforestry, because the allometry of the tree is different. So we, you know, we have like larger crowns and the biomass is larger when you compare a tree growing, you know, like with more space, what is common in agroforestry. So, and the way we measure that, I mean, when you have a good like allometric model, I mean, the way you're gonna do that in your farm, basically you're gonna need to do like an inventory. I mean, that's like the classic way to do it, right? You measure like the size of the trees, and then you pick like an allometric model that's gonna represent, you know, that system, that the allometry of the tree they're growing there. And that's a trivial way. But then nowadays we're, you know, using the different technologies to estimate carbon from all different kinds of forests and agroforestry. And Professor Robert mentioned about LiDAR in his talk, and LiDAR is being, you know, being used all over to estimate biomass. But again, you know, like your LiDAR data will depend upon the real biomass of a tree that's in an agroforest, and then you end up like needing an allometric model anyway, you know, to correlate the ground, the real data that's on the ground with the data that you collected through LiDAR. So I think I mean, the way we do measure these things are not different, but we do need like different allometric models to get more precise estimations of biomass. So. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can give my perspective on it as well. Thanks a lot for the insights, Daniel. And you're totally right when you say that most of the allometric models that are present in the literature are either based on natural forest or on plantations, which indeed have quite a different tree growth development. It's also particularly hard when you're diving into all these scientific publications to really understand what the really growth conditions were, what the climate was, what the soil types were, how the trees were managed. It's very, in a way, complex to take. Okay, oh, this is an allometric equation. Let's apply it to my system, and I get good confidence. There are so many factors that are influencing tree growth, well, at least what I can say within Acorn, we're currently using a tool which is called Farm Tree Tool, which is an online system where you can enter a lot of testing. It's specifically designed for modeling agroforestry systems. One of the outputs is also a carbon estimate. The funny thing is it's actually not principally based on allometric equations, but it's based on basically the calculation behind the photosynthesis process. So it really looks at, okay, how much photosynthesis is taking place, and takes into account all kind of limitations regarding water, temperatures, soil conditions, to kind of make an estimate of what we expect per species. But even there are a lot of assumptions behind that are it's often hard to get out of good databases or literature. And what we see, for example, when we're analyzing these systems, there are so many species being present in agroforestry systems. Of course, you have the typical, the mango and avocado and the cocoa tree, which you can have reasonable good data on. But then you always have a lot of native trees that you quite specific to a country or ecoregion, which you have take a lot of assumptions on, and then it's still being hard. And realize also that if you have a system and a tree is, for example, being pruned or being coppiced to a certain height, of course, that heavily affects the level of carbon that you may expect from a tree. Whereas if you would just leave a tree grow up to its full capacity, it may absorb much more carbon, and that's actually a trade-off. You know, often you manage a tree for fruit and nut production, and you keep it something relatively small, or you use cultivars that are relatively dwarf variety, for example. Look at the Hass avocado; it's a relatively small tree. Does it contribute a lot to the carbon sequestration? No, it does not. Does it contribute a lot to your yield and income? Yes, it can. So it's when you dive into the details, you will every species is a world in itself, and you see how many assumptions you need to make to get to good carbon estimates. And in that, of course, the best data is really measuring on a farm, okay, diameters, height, applying typical calculations to determine the biomass in the tree. You even have destructive sample where you really take all the tree and the roots out, and you're going to dry it and weight it. Well, that's quite exact, I can tell you that. But of course, it's not very practical and cost efficient. We rely on a combination of both ground truth data, indeed measuring diameters, height, look at species type. We also double check that with LiDAR. We look, of course, at wood density per species, but then we use that as an input for our biomass model, which is based on remote sensing technology, and that's how we can get to cost-efficient scaling and biomass measurements. And I think it will only in the future getting more technological in that sense. We have increased data quality and accuracy and pixel depth in with remote sensing technology. We have AI now also of assistance, so I think it will go that way, but it shouldn't be without any ground truth data, I would say.
Zico, to expand on that, and also for Emma, so could you explain a little bit more about going from that kind of mix between the ground truthing and the remote sensing? How do you communicate that and train or interact with farmers about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't go into much technical depth, I would say, and we keep it really as simple and straightforward as possible, where we explain, okay, what we see is, okay, when you grow a tree, it absorbs carbon. 1 ton of carbon is equal to, for example, I don't know, a block of wood, for example, of a certain size. And really showing that that relation between, okay, when you have bigger trees, it of course has more carbon. We do explain that we measure carbon biomass from with satellites, but you go up to a certain level in that sense, Gillian. And of course, when we go into the field and take ground truth data, you basically do a kind of forest inventory, foresters would call that. You of course have you work on farmers' plots, so you need to inform and be informing farmers about this, and that we can work on their fields. I see with most projects you have to keep it at a relatively untechnical level, so to say.
One thing to ask your group, I don't want to make this too long, but nobody has talked about the soils here. And there is still a controversy there, because some people say that the soils may be the same because there was a land use change and the soil underneath the system is the same. But the argument is that it's not, because the agroforestry system, because of everything we do, the nutrient cycle and everything, most likely has improved the soil. And so there is more carbon there, much more carbon. So by all means, using LiDAR especially, are they correcting for soils? I do not know. But imagine, depending on when you are, especially when you are in a semi-arid region, the amount of soil in this, the amount of carbon in the soil may be half of what it is in the whole system. If you're in a rainforest situation, maybe much less, depending on where you are in climate. Or temperate situations, it may be different too. But roots, I have seen that most models, like your model, SICO, corrects for roots, most likely because they're using photosynthesis. So it's the whole tree biomass. And then many people that I know measure the aerial biomass using allometric equations the best they can, and then use a factor correction. That's the IPCC accepted factor of a root to shoot ratio. So they account for that. But I have seen nobody accounting for soils. So in all, what I see is that the amount of carbon in agroforestry systems may be very much underestimated. That's my overall thinking. But I'll leave it to you because otherwise...
Yeah, maybe a brief comment, also not to use too much time for this question. Thanks for that comment. I think indeed the topic of soils is very important, and there can indeed be a lot of soil organic carbon outside of the root system. Do note that we do use allometric equations for determining biomass, but not for the prediction of how much growth will take place. So on the one hand, we have a prediction which we use for business cases, but we also use allometric equations for measuring the biomass in itself. We currently indeed use root shoot ratios to determine how much carbon is in the roots compared to the above ground biomass. Soil organic carbon is actually something that we're currently developing and looking into, also in terms of methodology. Of course, it's quite a bit harder with remote sensing technology. As you can imagine, and it's undoable to go to so many fields and take a lot of samples and determine all the soil carbon content in the soils. I also have the idea that really it takes quite a long time to build up really increases of soil organic carbon in agroforestry systems. Sometimes you can also overestimate the impact actually for how much is really occurring. And sometimes you read studies, there's a tons of biomass in the system, but then they look at they dig 1.5 meters deep into the soil, and then of course you can find a lot of soil organic carbon, but is that don't expect that from my perspective that if you plant a couple of trees in your system and after 5 or 10 years that really is already doubling or so. I think I have the idea that the soil organic carbon slowly grows over time, but I'm not a soil scientist, but I have the idea it shouldn't also be overestimated.
Well, I'll chime in a little bit here, maybe not on soil organic carbon, although there is with soil organic carbon sort of a curve, an adoption curve, first of all, and then an sequestration curve in there, and that sequestration curve does tend to saturate after maybe some time as well. So there's a limit to that. On the other hand, there is substantial potential there, but it's more on a 20-year kind of time frame, I would think, to really look at those returns. So the one thing I wanted to add to all these good points really is, once again, like, let's say the difference between monitoring a forest and monitoring an agroforestry system, the challenges there is really the complexity of the system. And not only that, but also the diversity of potential agroforestry systems across different biomes and climates. So there is no one size fit all. I don't think it really and needs to be, some protocols need to be tailored to the system, although we would like to have a comparable system so that we could compare like how well are these systems doing. But I think when you look at something like, for example, an agropastoral system in a semi-dry land, semi-arid, that might be easier to measure with allometric equations and limited species diversity. But when you come to things like home gardens, alley cropping, where it's integrally integrated with cropping and the household food system, and with a high diversity of crops, the challenge there's a major challenge on how to monitor and verify the carbon that's increased, because of course we have to show an additionality. We need to show that there's an increase in carbon over the previous system or with the improvements, or even just to sort of ascertain how much carbon is there on a year-to-year basis if there are harvests involved. So in a forest, we might have a 15 or 20-year rotation where we know what that harvest rotation is. If it's a saw log, timber, something rotation, then we can sort of calculate that over a long term, and we come up with a basic kind of carbon estimate. In agroforestry systems where it's much less regular, I'm not sure that people have really actually solved that challenge yet. So basically, my message is that there's a lot of complexity there, and I think that we definitely need protocols to be able to address it. I don't think we quite have them yet. That's my sort of summary.
Fred, you're muted.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Yo, for sharing. We'll move to our next question, and this question is directed towards Emma and Siko, and it reads, are there ways to balance or modify the requirements of additionality, permanence, etc., to make it easier for smallholder farmers to access funds for the carbon market? So Emma and Siko, and if any other one would like to touch on it, that would be really nice. So over to you.
Yeah, happy to answer this question because it's a question that we've been asking ourselves. When working in the voluntary carbon market, it's very important to respect the credit quality criteria. And so additionality, permanence, no leakage, those are core quality criteria. And instead of asking, can we loosen them? The question should be, can we cut the costs of meeting them? And that's where I think a lot of the work that we've done sits in, because you don't want to end up in, let's say, the lower tier carbon credit quality level. And this is a big risk when trying to balance both the needs of smallholder farmers and the demands of the carbon market. So an example here is looking at additionality from the perspective of a Western farmer. Let's say I'm in the Netherlands, I own a lot of land that I use for row cropping, and I want to transition that to an agroforestry system. As a Dutch farmer, I will have access to all of the knowledge because I can easily access the internet. I will be bankable. I will have a bank account. I will be able to get financing for any business case that makes sense. And I will have access to all of the inputs and seedlings and everything I need to make that transition. Whereas if I were a rural farmer in, let's say, let's pick Kenya, because that's one of the last countries I visited. Kenyan farmers don't often have access to all of the knowledge. Actually, very rarely do they have access to education like what Yale provides, which would be inaccessible to a Kenyan farmer in the countryside. as well as access to transport for all of the inputs needed, the support, the technical assistance on the ground. Often these farmers are not bankable. They don't have bank accounts. They can't take out loans. And so when you talk about the access to everything you would need for that intervention, it's not just can I afford it financially, but it's also can I access it much more from a physical and knowledge component. And so taking away those barriers is a very important thing for additionality, and carbon markets can actually do that. And so additionality works differently for smallholder farmers than for large-scale farmers. And for the market to really understand this is a very important thing. So what we've done with Acorn is take away all of those barriers, not just the financial barrier. And this allows for farmers to access the markets in a scalable manner. And so we didn't sacrifice additionality as a concept, but we rephrased it and took the perspective from the people that we're actually serving. So going beyond the financial additionality of the long-term investments needed, but also the reality on the ground. And so when I said, can you look at all of these points from a different perspective, we're also looking at the core carbon principles, for example, that as a blanket statement said, every project should have a 40-year permanence. And if you look at a smallholder farmer that is roughly 40, 50 years old, there's the chances of this farmer still working on the land as the steward of the land in 40 years from now is very slim. And so in terms of permanence, you'll also have to really communicate this to the market and look for buyers that understand that if they work with smallholder farmers, as opposed to, let's say, large jurisdictional REDD+ projects, they're going to have to look at permanence in a more humane way. And so find the buyers that really would agree with a 25-year permanence instead of a 40-year permanence, because we can promise 40 years to the buyers, but it wouldn't be reasonable and it wouldn't be humane and it wouldn't be fair. And making those types of promises is also dangerous because right now we can already predict that it won't be the same landowner or steward of the land that is taking care of that land 40 years from now that has signed the agreements today. So finding ways to deal with those criteria for permanence, for example, or for additionality is very important from the empathetic perspective of the smallholder. But don't sacrifice it, but really look at how can we make it work for them instead of how can we loosen the definitions.
Yeah, very nice comment, Emma. Basically, you have only a small thing to add. I would say, like, when you would look at permanence from the farmer perspective, already like farmers in the developing countries, they are typically living day by day and are often struggling with livelihoods and preoccupied, of course, with the farm and family. They won't think, of course, in occasional moments they think ahead. Okay, what will my kids do? What will my future farm be like? They may be concerned about climate change as well. They may be concerned about diseases on their farm, etc. They won't be concerned principally by, will I have when they are part of a carbon program, what will my will my carbon be staying on my farm in 20 years? That's more the Western perspective. And also realize that when you would plant typical fruit and nut trees, citrus, cocoa, coffee, you would typically renew them from a farmer perspective after the productivity start dropping. So which is often about after 20, 25 or 30 years. So that also means that that permanence is already limited often by typical farmer practices where you indeed limit renew crops because that's necessary. I can imagine that there may be ways of improving the production cycle of citrus and other fruit trees and nut trees over the long term by selecting the right varieties, doing the good management, keeping the soil health up and so. But still, there will be quite some renewal going on, and that makes it also important that you have methodology systems that say, okay, look, we actually know we that after 25 years they will renew cocoa and they will cut it down and they will plant new ones, or they do top grafting or something similar, which also at Acorn made us think through, okay, how we handle these kind of things, because the market expects, we will hope it get permanent and the carbon stays there for 50 years. So we actually had developed or is in development currently basically a renewal and harvesting methodology where we indeed can also allow for projects that they harvest trees for timber, or they renew fruit and nut trees, and that we actually will see a carbon drop in over time, but then we also assume that there will be new replants and the carbon cycle will go up again. And that's the only thing is fair and integer towards both the market and also to the farmer's interest.
I want to add one little point. So to modify the requirement of additionality, we can go for aggregate projects. Small stakeholder farmers can pool their land and resources into the large and collective projects. And this aggregation can reduce the individual cost and administrative burden, and making it more easier to meet the requirement of the carbon market. For example, in India, there is one fair climate network, which brings together the small stakeholder farmer to implement the sustainable agriculture practice, such as biogas and improved cooked stoves, and the network aggregate the carbon credit for these small projects and making it viable to access the international carbon market. And I think such approaches can reduce the individual verification cost and increase the market leverage also. So this is the small point I want to add.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And with the introduction of REDD+ and jurisdictional approach in our conversation, that leads us to our next question, which is actually going to be our last question from the compiled questions. And then we will have our audience ask live questions. And Ratnayak, you're going to be our first person from the audience to ask your question. So please prepare to unmute and ask your question. And the last question from our compiled questions goes to Tico and Azaria. So be prepared to ask. So I read. For REDD+, we hear a lot about the difference between a project-based approach versus jurisdictional approach. Firstly, would one of you be able to explain the difference between project-based and jurisdictional? And then how does this relate to agroforestry? So Azaria or Siko, you can take it from there.
Azaria, do you want to unmute yourself and comment? Are you here? Or if not, we can communicate with chat. Yeah, and then we can go to Siko. And then Azaria, if you're able to unmute, I know connection's challenging, so do that at any time. But Siko, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. So with REDD projects, I must say I haven't looked into the recent methodologies for about a year or maybe a bit more, but in principle, the difference between a project-based REDD project is that you have an actor, which is typically a private market player. It could be a company, it could be a large private landowner, which says, okay, I have a piece of land under management where I do my program, where I have practices and management that avoids deforestation taking place. And for that, of course, I am registering a REDD project, for example, with Vera or with Plan Bibo standard, and certifying that to obtain the carbon credits and getting the project impact. At a jurisdictional level, as far as my understanding goes, you basically make a deal where on a whole jurisdictional level, so for example, a province or a department, in theory, I think it can even be a country, where often the state is an actor, And it can also be, I think, in alliance with certain private parties or NGOs or companies, where they say, okay, we look at the whole administrative level of a certain region and ensure that at that level the carbon stocks in the forest and the deforestation the carbon stocks are maintained and the deforestation is reduced. So I think that's, for me, my perspective, the main difference. And the difficulty is a bit with these jurisdictional programs. They can be very large, of course. I mean, imagine a province in a tropical country that's often more than the size of Holland. I've not dived into much into this project, but I can imagine sometimes these projects are at such a high level and such a high scale that the people that are actually living in that province are not even aware of that there is a carbon project taking place. And sometimes it could also be the case that there are other project actors in the voluntary carbon market that develop their own reforestation activities, forest restoration, agroforestry programs, and that there could be an overlap indeed of RED projects, jurisdictional RED projects, and carbon projects which focus on reforestation. And there, of course, there comes in the difficulty, because actually the focus of these different type of programs is often different. You know, on one hand is conserving forests, and the other one is, we have certain areas which are void of forest or void of trees, and then we're gonna plant trees. So that those are actually removal projects, where you remove carbon from the atmosphere, while the other project does avoid emissions of carbon to the atmosphere. And I think we are just at the start of where there are many projects being developed at different levels, both from jurisdictional levels, sometimes by governments, and on the other hand by the carbon sector. And there is not yet a worldwide global registry where everybody can look into a system and say, okay, look, we have their project with the RED project, we have their carbon project. This is all still being kind of isolated in different certification systems, and that makes it a bit complicated. That's something that has to be developed in the carbon market itself. Of course, double claiming there is a topic, and it's of course being addressed by ICVCM, the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market. It's also, of course, being addressed in all the integrity standards and also in the accounting principles regulating carbon. But I think it's still a topic that requires far more work and an alignment between major players in the market. Also looking at Emma, that is keenly aware of this topic. Maybe she can add on.
Yeah, happy to follow up on this topic, because as an agroforestry developer, it's very important for you to know if you are part of a jurisdictional program. The difference between jurisdictional programs and privately managed programs as well is that the boundaries of a jurisdictional program are very often much bigger, but both programs have in common that in order to claim additionality, like we just discussed, there has to be an intervention. And so what we are seeing with many jurisdictional programs is that not every landowner is aware of their rights within the program. And so it could very well be that if you are practicing agroforestry in a region and there is a jurisdictional RED Plus program, that you could already be considered as part of that RED Plus program without you knowing it. And so it's really a call to farmers to check if you could perhaps be eligible for compensation, because if you are part of a RED Plus program, even without you knowing it, and that it should be the case because the idea is that the intervention makes you change your activities, it also means that you are not eligible to participate in other programs. And so you don't really have control anymore over how you might access voluntary carbon markets. So this is, I think, a very important thing for any project developer or even farmer to know, are you part of either a project level, a private sector project level RED Plus program that also includes private landowners and removals, carbon removals, and or are you part of a jurisdictional RED Plus program? Most jurisdictional programs don't have the capacity to preemptively reach out to every single person in that region, and that is a big issue as well when you talk about inclusion and making sure that really landowners change their behavior. So yeah, if you want anything to do with the voluntary carbon market, you need to know if you're part of a jurisdictional program, and also keep in mind that these laws can actually change. And so from our perspective as a bank, we want to invest as much as we can into making the transition to agroforestry for as many farmers as we can reach. However, there could be a risk that we invest now, and in 5 years from now, the regulation in that country change, and that country actually makes a claim and says, we are now the owner of all of the carbon that is sequestered on public and private land. Therefore, we cannot earn that investment back. So for Rabobank, it's a very big risk. Changing regulations, new projects popping up in countries that also prohibit us from making large investments. So having a good understanding of the regulations right now and how they might change in the future is a very crucial part of unlocking investments into your agroforestry system if your repayment structure would be the voluntary carbon markets, as well as knowing your own rights in terms of monetizing your achieved carbon results, so to say.
Thanks, Emma. I think that related to our next question about the regulations and the how that relates to the whether you're nested in a jurisdictional question. Was there anything else you wanted to say on that front, or that basically covered it?
Yeah, I think that really covered it. It's just a call, be aware of any programs in your area and keep an eye on changing regulations, and ask your regulators as well as your representatives to really take into consideration your rights and needs as someone who is really like a climate change steward, so to say.
Great, thank you. And I got a private message from Azaria. He can hear all of us, but his connectivity is not being great right now. So he'll try to comment on some of these questions after the session. Or Azaria, go ahead and either comment in the chat, or we can send out anything afterwards. But thanks so much for communicating that.
Yeah, so that brings us to the end of our compiled questions, and we'll begin with our live Q&A session. So our first person on the list is Ratnanyak. Abhi, can you unmute Ratnanyak and allow him to ask his question? After Ratnanyak, we will have Ahmed ask his or their question. So.
Hi, Ratnayak. We should have given you permission to unmute if you want to ask the question you submitted. And in the meantime, we can also call on Ahmed.
Ahmed, yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was really insightful. I was flowing in all the conversation. My question is, what are the methods and procedures used to accurately measure and verify the amount of carbon sequestered by agroforestry system, ensuring compliance with the international standard and also certification requirements? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. And this is for our speakers. We talked a little bit at the very beginning about some methods to measure carbon sequestration. And in this case, I think it's especially useful to hear from you guys about how to measure the right things or for international standards.
Yeah, if nobody speaks up, I will give it a try. So in principle, typical methodologies that have been developed by IPCC in the past for the Kyoto Protocol, but also developed further on by the main standard settings for voluntary carbon market credits, which are the Verra, the Plan Vivo, and the Gold Standard, for example. There are quite so many others, but these are the big ones. They typically rely on measuring forest trees according to the diameters at breast height, the height, of course, the species is involved, where you have certain equations and calculation methods to arrive at the amount of carbon in a tree. These things have been also developing more and more towards the use of remote sensing technology to also assist with that, to make measurements more cost efficient, because of course measuring even on sample basis all these trees in a forest or an agroforest system is quite a lot of work and costly. I think if I remember well, a typical sample size is about 1.5 or 2% of the total area of for example, a normal system methodology to determine good accuracies. As explained earlier with Acorn, we have basically a self-developed methodology, which is also externally approved to kind of make a combination between, on the one hand, ground truth data sets, where we indeed measure the diameters and the height and look at the species, combination with remote sensing technology to determine biomass at a large for each individual plot. That's what I can say about it. Of course, the allometric equations and calculations how to derive the specific amount of carbon based on these parameters you can also find in quite some technical documents, methodology, for example, at the Verra, Plan Vivo, Gold Standard, and IPCC websites.
Yeah, and I would just add to complete, because you have developed your own model for your projects, both in temperate countries and developing countries, so they suit each need. And I would just add that you have your own model that you have developed through the years, so it's quite accurate. I would add for the question that was asked, perhaps this person is not associated with an institution that already has a model, but there are so many models that are out there. They are in the websites. I mean, you'll find them in the internet, and you'll see what's best suits your needs, the need of the project. And most of the models have been developed for context-specific situations, like for carbon, for coffee, agroforestry, for example, or for this and that. So you just have to select which is the best model for you, and be sure what are the parameters, because sometimes the models are overly simple, like some of the FAO models. They're too simple, and they only let you input certain parameters, which is essentially the climate, which is a major determinant, as you know, of carbon sequestration worldwide. But those are available in the internet. I'm sure you can find them.
And maybe to add to this, measuring the carbon sequestration is one component, but it's not everything you need to do to connect with the voluntary carbon market. And so often the measurement side requires quite a lot of input in terms of time and effort and budget. Going to the field, doing hand measurements, if you opt in for a hand measurement methodology, which you would if you don't have a fully trained remote sensing model. But then still there are certain other barriers to access the voluntary carbon market, which could be very much mitigated by aggregating multiple projects, like-minded farmers in one region, to collect a larger total hectare of land. This is as well what Sadiq also mentioned about the Indian project, where many farmers come together and collectively apply for a certification or solution. And using this aggregate approach can really cut the costs of both measurements but also certification. This is a very important thing to emphasize, because I've seen a few other questions as well about financing these types of interventions, what do we need to do to get access to finance? And I think there also the answer lies really in collective application for larger grants, larger financiers. And I can only really speak for Acorn, where we have put in a lot of effort to aggregate from a bank's perspective as many smaller farmer groups as we can find through very strong local partners who know the farmers well. This can be farmer cooperatives, this can be NGOs that are very active in the region, that have a long-term presence and are very much trusted and liked by the communities. So those types of approaches could really help in cutting the costs of these types of things, and not just measurements, but also access to finance and certification. Just to help elaborate a little bit on the urgency of larger groups, the voluntary carbon market is not made for smallholder farmers. And it's not even made for farmers, I'd say, even if they're large scale. So grouped projects are a very important tool to still have access to that market.
Yeah, access to finance is always an issue when it comes to smallholder farmers. And this relates to Ratnanyak's question, which I'm going to read out loud. Please, Ratnanyak, if you have anything to add on, please, you can unmute and add it. So the question reads, in developing countries, training and trained professionals play a key role in carbon calculation and awareness programs, but financial crises in those countries are the main problem for such training. How can we resolve this issue?
Yeah, I think there are two parts of this question. So there's the finance for the actual projects or the implementation, which, as Emma explained, it's so hard when the system's not set up for small scale. So joining together is a main activity that can help with that. But then also this question is really interesting because it brings up the other aspects that need funding. You can't just have outreach and education without funding to go into that, whether it's governments, nonprofits, or other entities doing that. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in hearing about the idea of training and capacity building on these themes, both how does it fund, and then also kind of who's doing it, or what are you seeing out there to facilitate that farmer to farmer engagement. Or I think Siko mentioned earlier, one of the best things to observe, or best things to try to spread the word about these systems, is for farmers to see it being implemented in practice from other farmers. So how can we help facilitate that?
Okay, well, it's not totally my field here at this, that's sort of above my pay grade, really, but I will chime in. So these are really matters of well, there are several levels here. Of course, that there are NGOs and civil society that are working and work at levels with farmers and do farmer to farmer exchanges and even South-South exchange kind of programs. I'm involved with that from between China and Africa, where there's a exchange of germplasm and technologies. But really, of course, what we're talking now, we've gotten to policy issues, national and subnational policy issues, and making this a priority within the agricultural extension and within agricultural policy or environmental policy, or if it becomes a priority in meeting their national contribution, national development, NDAs or NDCs, their contribution that they need to show. If this becomes a priority, then the incentive for funding to follow that priority would hopefully come along. And of course, capacity building, outreach, training, capacity building is of course essential in any of these things. And those can be addressed at various levels. And there's challenges there from in many countries, the educational system itself is not particularly well funded. Students have a hard time going to school. Farmers have a hard time sending their kids to school. And but making that a higher priority and a policy priority is probably at the national and subnational level, one of the main drivers to create that funding for capacity building. I think capacity building is well recognized as an important component of extension outreach and sustainable development. And so in places where there's a scarcity of resources, it's really a matter of priority and will, and convincing people how important this particular system is as well. So there are a lot of challenges there, of course, and it's a matter of really rising up to meet those challenges with the resources allocated where they're going to be needed and do well. That's my little input there.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and thank you for addressing the question. Does any of our panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, I want to add one point. So, like in India, we have national agroforestry policies also. So what the thing is, integration these national policies with the global goals. Like this can enhance the funding, expertise, and support mechanism also to the people, because these policies we know, and we like the youngster, we learning about climate and environment separately. We are like learning about these things separate, but we can integrate it, and these policies integration can help to enhance the fund. What I think.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. Siko, would you like to add anything? You unmuted initially.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think one of the maybe the more challenging part, of course, the typical extension work has already been done for decades to typical development agencies, also FAO, USA kind of projects. I think one of the always a challenge is how to make that cost efficient and reach a lot of farmers, and not spending hundreds of dollars on for each farmer, so to say, because that's simply too costly to get to cost efficient operations. And somewhere technology should also help there, and that's a bit of a tryout now. Like, okay, we know often these farmers don't have maybe mobile phones, for example, but maybe some have. There is an increasing adaptation, of course, of even maybe some WhatsApp groups. And I know of a partner in Colombia that uses actually WhatsApp channels to go through a whole course and question answer automatically, question answer sessions where farmers can at least ask questions, and of course with AI technology that is even better to do. So that maybe is not a solution for all the farmers, especially for maybe the older generation, but at least the younger generation, I think can be more easily approached on via mobile networks, which of course are way cheaper than organizing a session in the field and having everybody come over and paying costs for trips and a lunch break and and the venue, etc. So somewhere technology needs to help to make to transfer knowledge better, in a cost efficient way.
Yeah, thank you, Siko, and I agree with your idea that we should use technology, especially emerging social media, because we have it all over, and it's being used for various reasons. And I think it would be good if we tap into the trending issues and use it for our own benefits. So this brings us to the end of the live Q&A session. I know it has been a very interesting discussion, and we still have some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but most of them has been addressed initially and through answering some of these questions. So we'll move on to Dr. Florencia Montagnini to give us our closing remarks.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me put it in. Hold on. How do I do to make it go as a? I need to move this thing here. Okay, here. There. Okay, do you see it all right?
Perfect.
All right. Well, it's been such a pleasure. I learned so much from you today. Absolutely incredible. So I'm going to give you my closing remarks, and this wraps up everything, because remember, I gave you the introduction a few weeks ago. And first, just to put us in a good context, the variability, the heterogeneity of agroforestry systems worldwide, which is something that Sarika showed in her presentation to all those incredible agroforestry systems that are in India. And well, everyone has shared through the presentations. But when we're thinking about agroforestry and the role in climate change, imagine we're dealing with all these type of systems. But the amount of agroforestry worldwide, and there are some prevalent systems that, like the perennial trees with crops and the home gardens multi-strata and the silvopasture and the riparian buffer. So we can make models and assumptions because there are some agroforestry systems that are more prevalent than others. So that's something that we can live with. And the amount of agroforestry systems worldwide, some estimations that are there, 1,000 million hectares worldwide, that's something. So so what do we what do we see during these 3 weeks or 4 weeks, because this is number 4? Well, first, during the introduction, we put emphasis on the fact that agroforestry is very important for adaptation to climate change. So that's something to keep in mind, because it puts us in perspective. But in mitigation, there were 2 aspects that we wanted to talk about. One is carbon sequestration, but then the other part of mitigation role of agroforestry, apparently nobody touched on that, except I touched on it briefly in the introduction when we were talking about experiences to decrease the amount of emissions by cattle during all kinds of good measurements for sustainable silvopastoral systems, but nobody has touched on that. We devoted our time more to other important things like measurements of carbon sequestration, which is something that I'm so happy that we talked about today in good detail, because as you saw today, there is so much in terms of above ground, below ground biomass that sometimes it's ignored. And soil carbon, we still left the question not totally answered today in terms of how much the soil carbon will improve in agroforestry. The improvements may be slow, but we should consider them. And I think Robert Zomer gave a good answer about that. How long are we there with our system? What's the additionality there in terms of the carbon? Models and tools, I think we covered them a lot about that today. I'm so happy that people like Zico and Emma talked about their models. And then some people were asking from the audience about models and tools that are so useful, but remember, they have to be context specific and adjusted to your situation. The heterogeneity of agroforestry around the world, we talked about that. Sarika gave a good demonstration of that. The farmers' preferences for each system, and the most important thing, the legislation in India that she talked about it today and how effective it is. Extent of agroforestry worldwide. That's what Robert was talking about during the first session. What can additional tree planting do to sequester more carbon? So he gave us some insights on that. How much, what are the goals? Where should we plant the trees? He showed us some priority regions and potentials. The potential is greater in the semi-arid regions of the world. And then he gave us specific countries where they should be planting more trees. Climate is the main determinant of carbon sequestration. And I think Robert may put emphasis on that too. Well, in the second webinar here, we have our people. So Azaria talked about his projects in in Africa and how important they are. Projects on the ground, Carbon Tanzania, so interesting. And he made emphasis on the fact that agroforestry can be costly, but there are so many benefits to consider as well. So that's a very important thing there. It's not moving my, oops, why not? I do not know why it's not moving. My screen is not moving. Here, finally it did. So Daniel was here today, and he gave us some insights in terms of the difficulties of measuring carbon, because that's what he presented when he was here during the second webinar, carbon sequestration in the Cabruca, which is the agroforestry of cacao under the forest, versus the conventional cacao agroforestry. And he made emphasis, he put emphasis during his presentation on the fact that Cabruca is more diverse because it's under the forest and it has less input, so it's more accessible to the country, easier to the farmers, although it has lower productivity, but they have more areas, so they compensate for that in terms of comparing with conventional cacao agroforestry. But the interesting thing is that where he's working in Bahia in Brazil, actually they don't have access to carbon markets, but there are more than 2 million hectares of cacao in the state of Bahia, which is a large state in Brazil, and the state of Espírito Santo, which is next to it. So there is a great potential there in other parts of Brazil. Although SICO, they are working in some parts of Brazil and others. Then SICO gave a presentation during the second webinar on the Agroforestry Hub, the Rabobank Acorn, the projects in Brazil. He explained to us, and he went on some detail today on technical assistance that they provide, and they work with large scale. So they are not talking about small, they're talking about smallholder farmers, but in all they're covering large scale. So that's so interesting. And they're talking about the grouping of the farmers in cooperatives. So we learned about that a lot, and we learned some from Sarika today, what they do in India as well. And then during the final last week, when we had the webinar number 3, we again talked, well, first Peter, who wasn't able to be here today, he apologized. He gave us a good view from the point of view of GEF, where he's working, all the standard programs, emissions verification, all the regulations that we need to follow, and especially the requirements of additionality, permanence, measurable, monitoring and verification, no double counting, all that, as we see, it's so difficult to verify. And then Emma was suggesting today, are there ways that we can play with that? And I think there are very good suggestions about that, because otherwise we can fall into a trap. It's not measurable, it's not permanent. How permanent it may be, sometimes, as Emma was saying, farmers live on a day-by-day basis. But Emma gave us a good explanation from her point of view of the farmers in Holland, in the Netherlands, how they work with them, and the differences of working in a temperate country where she lives, and then where she's working with the major bank, and the farmers in Africa. That's a very different thing. And then she explained to us their technologies using measuring annual biomass change, but doing a ground truth and using LiDAR data. So that's today, it's I would say that's the top in terms of methodologies. What we need is the ground truth verification for that. The Plan Vivo certification, the carbon removal units, that's very important. So I'm going to close with some key messages. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't agree, but what I extracted from this webinar is like, we can conclude that several types of agroforestry, in spite of their heterogeneity, have the potential to catch some of the carbon that we are always emitting to the atmosphere. We're still doing it through deforestation. Deforestation is still happening in spite of everything we say. Other emitters like industrial and cars and everything. So agroforestry can do it, but the species, the designs, the tree rotation ages, the management of agroforestry play a large role in the amount of carbon they can catch up or sequester. So monitoring, remember, must include the above, the below ground biomass, and there's still some doubts whether the soils, how they can be included or not. Allometric equations, it's so important. They should consider ages, locations for each species, and Daniel today was making emphasis on most allometric equations being developed from forest trees, but in agroforestry, most of the trees are planted, or in some cases are planted. The carbon tools, we talked about them before, they may be useful, they must be context dependent. You need to really know what kind of tool you're using. And then the complexities of regulation and standardization, the monitor and evaluation, additionality, the perverse incentives that can exist for carbon sequestration in agroforestry, all that we talked about today. And finally, as a climate solution, remember that although they cannot replace the full amount of carbon in forests, generally the measurements tell us that the carbon in agroforestry system will be about half what it is in a forest in the region where you are having the project. So they cannot replace the full amount of carbon, but they have the added benefit of providing products and foods to local people, ecosystem services such as conservation of biodiversity. So in carbon, we can say that agroforestry is a win-win solution. But who will do it or who is doing it? The preference of landowners for planting trees in their agricultural system may depend on technical knowledge, and we put some emphasis on technical assistance. And we were talking with Sico and Emma about how they use the leading farmers to transmit some of that knowledge to. Availability and types of incentives, we talk about that a lot, and I was mentioning that, of course, we're talking about the markets for carbon being incentives and the markets for biodiversity credits being a market as well for incentives. But somehow we need to empower the local smallholders to plant trees in their agricultural systems, and hopefully we have many NGOs, government incentives that are in, Robert mentioned the government incentives in temperate countries like in the US, in Europe. Smallholders associating together in cooperatives and other systems to be able to access markets, as Sarika was mentioning for India. That's so important, and I asked her more specific information about that because it's so important. One of my doctoral students in Argentina is working exactly on that, how they can group the farmers. So the lessons from India are very important there. And remember to close that we're talking about carbon, but agroforestry can also play an important role in adaptation to climate change. And we need to face that reality because you know that climate change is already here. It's happening. We can still plant more trees to avoid it going worse, but it's still here. So the farmers need to adapt to climate change, and agroforestry is an excellent tool for that. So with that, I just thank you. And here we are, the planning committee. Thank you for your attention. And we hope to see you soon in another webinar or in one of our ELTI courses, any of the activities we have at Yale. And it's been such a pleasure to work with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Florencia, for the closing remarks. I would be happy if you can stop sharing your screen yet. Thank you.
Yeah, I just did. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much to all our panelists for taking the time to record your videos and also to be present and share with us your presentations. I know that a lot of you are posting in the chat that you found this webinar very interesting and you would like to have more of this. So I would encourage you to sign up to our mailing and events list so that you get emails about our events immediately we start planning or when we plan to have any event. Also, I noticed that some of you missed some of the episodes, and don't worry if you missed any webinar, because we have all our webinars on our YouTube channel, so feel free to go back and watch. You can pause, rewatch, and then even put it on fast mode if you like listening to it fast. Also, for more information about ELTI, you can visit our website at elti.yale.edu. And also, if you need any information about our year-long online certificate program, you can visit our website at tropicalrestorationcertificate.yale.edu. Also, feel free to send us an email through tropicalcertificate@yale.edu. I noticed that some of you are interested in other topics. Please feel free to send us your topics through our email. You can also interact with us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And again, from the webinar planning committee, we are very happy to have you all, and we say a big thank you to everyone who was involved in this webinar. So yeah, thank you and take care.